Minister, I would appreciate some answers.
I call the honourable member Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And this call I want to take on this particular part will focus on Section 14. And I want to be very clear, Mr. Chair, what this clause is about. It's amending what is already a very bad part of the law that was passed only 6 weeks ago to restrict the rights of people to protest. And John Key loves to go around on the world stage, shake hands with people like Barack Obama, show up to events that are about opposing nuclear proliferation, about celebrating New Zealand's place in the world as an anti-nuclear country, and he has his photograph taken and he says he supports this. Well, where does Mr. Key and Mr. Bridges, where do they think New Zealand's status in the world as a country that stands up against nuclear weapons, where do they think that comes from? It comes from New Zealanders getting out on boats and in dinghies and getting out there in the 1970s and the 1980s and saying, we're not prepared to see the world go about destroying itself. We want to make sure that we stand up for people and the planet, and we're going to get out and protest in those boats and in those dinghies. That is the kind of dissent that has led to good law in New Zealand. It's the kind of dissent that has led to New Zealand being respected on the world stage. And this government is prepared to chuck that away because some corporate interests have asked them to do it. And that is the bottom line here. Corporate interests dictating New Zealand's legislation again. We've had it with Warner Brothers, we've had it with Sky City, and now we have it with companies who do not want to see protesters too close to them. And this government is prepared to sacrifice all that history of protest in New Zealand, all that history of dissent in New Zealand, so to appease these companies. It's as simple as that, Mr. Okenvold. That is what has happened with this law. And that is bad enough, Mr. Speaker, to trash New Zealand's reputation, to sell off our laws one more time. But what's more than that is that this government can't even make a case for why it's expanding it, and potentially is doing something that actually goes against our international obligations. I'm wondering if the Minister has had the time to have a read of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website. Because what that says is, and I'll quote from it, states do not have any specific rights to the water column above the continental shelf. So New Zealand does not have special rights to the fisheries above the continental shelf beyond the EEZ, or to control other activities such as shipping. That is an exact quote, Minister, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade website. So the Minister could get on his feet and actually explain how it is that he's passing a law through this House tonight that appears to go against what New Zealand is actually allowed to do when it comes to the continental shelf. But the Minister doesn't seem to care about that. The Minister doesn't want to actually get up and explain whether he's even allowed to make this law. So he's selling the law off, and he will not even explain how he can justify expanding that to a massive extra 1.7 million square kilometres. 1.7 million square kilometres extra. And we don't even, according to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, actually have the right to make any law in that area. And yet the Minister comes to this House. And as Moana Maki said, we'll be back here in a month with yet another amendment bill after Mr Bridges makes the sensible decision to put it as a standing item on the order paper, so we can just keep coming back to it, and he will have to correct another mistake. And Mr Speaker, there are other matters about the continental shelf that the Minister doesn't appear to have taken into account. The continental shelf overlaps with different other countries' jurisdictions. Now, we actually have an agreement with the Australians around where the continental shelf overlaps with us. It's around the Lord Howe Rise through to the Three Kings Ridge. We have that agreement. The problem for the Minister and the problem for the government is we don't have that agreement with other countries where the continental shelf overlaps with their jurisdictions. Fiji and Tonga, for instance, being two examples. We haven't done anything about that when it comes to other areas, the Kermadec Ridge being one of those. So the government has two areas where it appears to be actually breaching international law about whether it can even put this up. Now, these, Mr Chair, are the issues that would be being discussed at a select committee. In fact, they would have already been, Mr Chair, they would have already been discussed at a select committee, and we would now, no doubt, be looking at amendments to the law because the government had stuffed up. But instead, Mr Speaker, at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, we've got a bill being shoved through in the interests not of New Zealanders, not even in the interests of our Pacific neighbours whose territory this impinges upon, but in corporate interests, in the vested interests for whom this government, the National Party, seem to believe they are governing. Because that's what we see time and time again. We saw it with Sky City, and what a shameful, shabby deal that is. We saw it with Warner Brothers. Our laws are for sale under this government. And what's more, we're going to have to pay to change the law in the case of Sky City because of the compensation arrangements that have been put in place here. If we want to change the gambling laws, we'll be paying for it. And now, under this law, we have a situation where we have been pushed into changing the law to ensure that the corporate interests are kept happy. We're not protecting New Zealanders' rights to protest, and the Attorney-General likes to interject on these matters. He's living in his own golden age over there, the Attorney-General, the saviour of the art scene, a legend in his own Twitterverse, the Attorney-General, but he's sitting there today as the right to protest is limited. He's sitting there today as the right to dissent is limited. What kind of Attorney-General is that? Why don't we have an Attorney-General who stands up for the rights of New Zealanders to protest? Why don't we have an Attorney-General who actually comes to this House and says to his government, no way, I'm not accepting this. New Zealanders have the right to protest. But instead we have an Attorney-General who sits on Twitter trying to come up with his own achievements in the arts sector, and he does not care about a bill that is before this House that severely limits what New Zealanders would see as their basic rights. Mr Chair, this bill is deeply flawed. This amendment bill to the Amendment Act is deeply flawed. New Zealanders right across the country have expressed their concern about this, dismissed by people like Chris Finlayson and the Prime Minister, Geoffrey Palmer, Dame Anne Salmon, the New Zealander of the Year. John Key will have his photograph taken with Dame Anne Salmon, but when she signs a letter that says this kind of law change, limiting the right to protest is wrong, suddenly she's dismissed. She's totally taken out of the picture. Well, Mr Chair, this is absolutely poor lawmaking. It's shabby lawmaking, it's sloppy lawmaking. We're back in front of this House with an extension to this, and once again, the Minister needs to get up and answer the question that a lot of New Zealanders are wanting to know. Who's behind this? Who's behind this change? Which companies asked for it? Who's come to Simon Bridges and put the pressure on him? Because there are important aspects of this law that Simon Bridges is responsible for protecting the rights of New Zealanders. And it seems to us on this side of the House that he's caved. He's caved straight away. As soon as someone's come to him and said, can you please extend this already bad law out? He's caved. He said, yes, I'll take it out to the continental shelf. That's fine. Even if New Zealand doesn't even have a right to make a law in that place, he'll take it out. Mr Chair, this bill and this part, Section 14 of this bill, are typical of this government. They're typical of a government who are no longer governing in the interests of New Zealanders. They're governing in corporate interests and overseas interests, in the interest of their mates, not in the interests of ordinary New Zealanders. This clause should not pass.
I'm calling Eugenie Sage.
Thank you, Mr Chair. This bill, and in terms of part